Okay everyone, so today I want to visit with you a little bit more about shutter speed, that last pillar of the exposure triangle that you really need to be familiar with so that you are in full control when you're taking photographs. One, you know how to control aperture now and then vary the depth of field, but two, with that shutter speed, we need to know our minimums to be able to handhold, generally about 1/50th of a second, and then you need to also determine whether you want to imply motion in a photograph and perhaps things are blurred intentionally, or whether you want to freeze action and freeze frame, okay? With horses, generally speaking, we want to freeze action, okay? Rarely, maybe you get creative and you want to do some type of motion blur, but most of the time we're trying to freeze action. Remembering that our minimum, generally speaking, to be able to freeze action is 1/500th of a second, okay? It depends on a couple things. Depends on if the object is moving left to right in front of the camera like this, you're gonna need a faster shutter speed than if it's coming towards and away from the camera like this. It's not gonna have to be quite as fast, and so keep that in mind, okay? And so pay attention to that when you're taking photographs. Addition to that, again, we've got our top display here in Aperture Priority right now, and I'm going to take some photos. I was in here earlier with Tiari riding, and I'm just going to show you a little bit of that video and show you some of the resulting photographs. I'm in Aperture Priority because I like to shoot in that majority of the time. There's nothing wrong with that. Being able to set aperture, I've got it on about f5 right now, f5.6, and ISO sitting around 200, okay? And so let's look at that little video right now of them riding around in the arena, and you can see that as they're moving around, again, we got good light. We could probably take the ISO down to 100, but at 200, we've got about 1/1000th of a second with a shutter speed, okay? If I drop it to 100 ISO, I'm going to go down to 1/500th of a second with my shutter speed, which is my bare minimum, okay? And so again, I want to be sure that I'm truly freezing action just fine, okay? When I look through the camera viewfinder, again, I can see all three elements of that exposure triangle: aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, okay? This top display is also handy for that. If you would rather shoot in a shutter priority mode, you designate it's 1/800th of a second, that's fine. If you want to shoot in full manual, that's fine. You now know how to read the light meter on the top of your camera or in the viewfinder to be sure you have a correct exposure, okay? And so we're going to take a few photos here, and we're going to see what that looks like with Tiari coming around the bend right here. And you can see basically as we snap these off and fire them off, again, we've got some good consecutive photos. I've got my camera, of course my focus point is in a good spot, it's on a single point focus point, but I've got my camera set so that it is in a continuous high setting. It's going to take up to 6, maybe 8, maybe 10 frames per second depending on that camera body and the model, okay? That's incredibly fast. So as that horse is coming around the corner and up over some jumps, I can catch everything in that arc. Racehorses barreling down the track, I can catch all that movement of those footfalls, okay? And so I really do keep it in continuous high all the time because it's advantageous for equine photography, okay? And so, again, watch these horses as we move around. We'll take a few more pictures here. Again, we're at about 1/1000th of a second. We can increase the size of our aperture, make it a little bit larger. Now go to about f3.2, and all of a sudden we've got about 1/2000th of a second, okay? And so again, really, really cool to be able to adjust that shutter speed and have the control over that. The other elements that I want you guys to be able to control are maybe implying or blurring motion. Now, it's a bright sunny day. It's going to be tough to slow that shutter speed down enough because there's so much daylight out here. And so I'll take you over to the hot walker here momentarily, and I'm going to show you how to do that during a daylight scenario. We'll use a neutral density filter to be able to accomplish that. And then the last thing I want to show you relates to some panning, okay? And hopefully after those three discussions, again, you have a better idea of how to control your camera and the shutter speed. Remember, the other thing to pay attention to is your lens choice, okay? Again, this is a 2.8 max to aperture lens, and so I can let a lot more light in with this lens, which means I can get a faster shutter speed than somebody that has a max aperture of 5.6, okay? So lens choice is another one. Distance between you and the subject, okay? If I'm very, very close to a subject and trying to track it, I'm gonna have a lot faster shutter speed than I've got a horse way over here at the repro lab off in the distance at a straight gallop, but it's a lot easier to follow, and I can have a slower shutter speed for it off in the distance. So the closer it is to me, if it's right here in the arena in front of me, I'm going to need a much faster shutter speed. And so remember these other things that are going to in turn affect that shutter speed that you choose, okay? And so with that, let's pop over to the hot walker and we can talk a little bit about blurring motion, okay? Okay everyone, so I want to talk to you a little bit more about implied motion. Now that can be tough in the middle of the day, but you can use it as a creative tool with many other photographs you take, okay? That blurred motion, okay? But I want it to be intentional, not the fact that you just had your shutter speed too slow as the horse came by and all of a sudden it's blurry, okay? Not the same thing. And so generally we would do long exposures at night, okay? And those long exposures at night, much easier to do, okay? You could put a small aperture on your camera and put it at f/22, f/16. You're probably gonna get a pretty long shutter speed and you can get a natural exposure that looks really cool with some streaks of lights coming down the mountain or anything else. To be able to accomplish that during the day right now, we're gonna use something that we call a neutral density filter, okay? And so basically it's just a dark piece of glass that we're going to put over the front of our lens, okay? So it's going to make it appear darker, like nighttime, than it actually is. This is going to allow me to take a picture of something like this hot walker. It'd be cool if we had horses on it, but you can still see motion in the background of this hot walker. It's going to allow me to slow that shutter speed down enough to be able to capture that motion. So I can come out here and do a cool photograph to illustrate, hey, there's horses working on this hot walker, and instead of just freezing them as they're on it, have it as kind of a blur of them moving around. And again, it could be creative and be a little bit of a neater photograph. And so let me go ahead and put this on our camera and I'll show you what that looks like, okay? The other thing that I wanted to show you is a shutter release cable, okay? They make these in a wireless version or a corded version. This happens to be the corded version. This attaches to my camera body. And then if you're doing a long exposure, slow shutter speed, this is absolutely recommended, okay? Even you just going on top of that camera and pushing the shutter button is enough to create camera shake that is going to see blur in your photograph. And so this attaches to your camera. You're not going to bump anything. You're not going to create that blur. When you want to basically press this, we could use this to just take one picture just simply by going like this, or if we want to do a long exposure for a minute, we could simply depress this and hold it, or there's a little lock button on this side where it stays depressed. I could look at a timer, count 60 seconds, 2 minutes, however long I want to leave that shutter open. When I'm done, push this again, it releases that shutter and I have my long exposure. And so you got to have a shutter release cable if you're going to do any type of creative photography, long exposure, implied motion, etc. Okay, so right now you can see we've got our camera set up here. I've changed lenses. We've got a 24 to 70 millimeter lens on right now, and we've got our hot walker going around so we can see some implied motion. Looking at the front of this right now, it's just our UV filter. Here you can see I've got my neutral density filter. Now this is a pretty fancy one because it's variable. I can turn the ring on this and increase or decrease essentially the level of that filter and how dark it is. And so this is just going to screw on to the front of this UV filter. The threads are fine. It takes a minute to get that. So you can see that go on to this camera lens, and now it's got this very dark front to it. And so we've got this still in an aperture priority mode, if you guys can see that. And the thing about this is I've got it right now just to show you difference. I've got it at f/22 and ISO 100. Okay, so this is something that is drastically changed already. We have this at 1/20th of a second. When I did not have the neutral density filter on, it was at 1/50th of a second, okay, and that was as slow as it could go. And so now let's go ahead and make it darker, okay? We can make that darker as we look into the camera, and now I look at the top and it says 2 seconds. 2 in those little parentheses, quotations, not parentheses, but quotations that you see next to it designate that it's seconds now. It's otherwise, if you just saw 2, it would be 1/2 of a second, okay? And so that's what that designation means. We're still f/22, and so I just was able to go with this neutral density filter from 1/50th of a second, which you're not going to see much motion blur, to now going down to 2 seconds, okay? So now let's put our shutter cable on, and you guys can see what that might look like. And so if we go around to the front of the camera here, you guys can see these little ports that sit right here, okay? This is going to allow us to attach this shutter cable, okay? We can push that in and it just simply screws into the camera, okay? This allows me this shutter release that you see right here, and if I push this button, did you hear that? All of a sudden we just took a picture, okay? And so now we can turn around, go back, focus, take a 2-second exposure, And there you go, you can see it on the screen and what that might look like, okay? So again, quick video, but hopefully you can then see how you can do a long exposure or longer exposure and apply a little bit of motion, and especially how you can achieve that during the day. You could do the same with a waterfall. During the day you could use something like that neutral density filter, or we could go do that long exposure at night. Same setup, we just wouldn't need that dark ND filter, but we would want our shutter release cable on there just the same. And so let's go back in the arena. I want to show you a little bit more about panning. Okay, so I've got you back here, and the last thing that I want to visit with you about in regards to shutter speed is that technique we call panning. Panning is a really cool technique that you can do with a number of things. We could do it with a car, be a lot easier than maybe a horse. That car sticking very parallel to the ground. That horse, you gotta remember the legs are moving, and so you'll see body generally stay still, but you might see some movement in the legs. Panning, I'm going to move my camera to manual, and I'm going to put it at about 1/30th of a second, okay? It means my aperture is going to be about f18, it looks like, and you guys can still see these folks riding around this arena, and we're going to take a few shots of panning, okay? And so the things to remember, the key here is you have to keep that camera, hold it correctly, okay? You have to keep it very, very still and not moving, and then move at the same speed and parallel to your subject. The other thing to remember is to follow through when you're taking a picture, or don't stop, okay? Click that shutter and continue to follow through so you have nice streaks, okay? So if you do a panning shot right, hopefully you've got a busy enough background. The background is then streaked and your subject stays clear. You could do this with a cyclist, you could do it with a car, you can do it with those horses, okay? But panning is that cool technique that then applies a further generalization that you have movement in the photograph, okay? And so implying motion in a different way, okay? And so panning is something that you do need to practice and do need to get used to. It's something that, again, can be a little bit frustrating in the beginning. And so I encourage you guys, if you get the chance, try some panning shots, okay? And so we've taken a couple here of Tiari in the arena as she basically moves past us. And again, I think we've got a decent panning shot. But we could go do this in a car, a cyclist, or anything else. And so I do want you to be familiar with that panning technique. If you're struggling with it, you may also turn off the vibration reduction on your lens. Sometimes it picks up panning, sometimes it is okay with it, and it'll allow it to be a good clear shot, okay? And so with that, I hope you guys learned a little bit more today about shutter speed, okay? Both how to freeze action, making sure that that is an important pillar, also how to blur that motion and what that might look like as a result. You could do a long exposure photography at night, okay? Again, a great thing to go up and do on Horsetooth or somewhere else and get streaks of the headlights and the taillights and the stars and everything else. Long exposure is really cool to do, okay? I've seen pictures of a carousel at a fair just turning, okay? Again, cool things to imply motion. And then again, hopefully a little more familiar with panning, which is another technique that relates to our discussion on shutter speed. And so with that, I'll leave you for the day, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.